Ever feel like you really want a relationship, but there's this sort of thing holding you back? Like maybe you're a bit guarded or, just unsure if you're even ready to step out there. Well, let's dive in. Today, we're exploring some really fascinating ideas from Mark Ballinger's book, 100 Relationship Signs: How to Know What God is Saying to You in Singleness and Dating. And we're focusing specifically on Chapter 4. This is where the author lays out signs he believes might indicate it's time for you to be, well, more open to the possibility of a relationship.
Yeah, and our goal here is really to unpack these signs, understand the author's perspective, and see what he suggests you can actually do if they resonate with where you're at. We're drawing insights from across the material you shared.
Okay, so diving into Chapter 4, right off the bat, the author brings up Proverbs 4.23, keep your heart with all vigilance. Now, that sounds like a call to protect yourself, doesn't it?
It does.
But he immediately makes this crucial distinction between guarding your heart and walling your heart off. What's the difference there, according to the source?
It's a really important starting point, I think. Guarding your heart, as the author presents it, it's about wise discernment, being careful, thoughtful about who you open up to. It's presented as healthy protection.
Okay,
But walling your heart off, that's different. That's like building emotional barriers so high, so thick that no one can get in, usually out of fear of getting hurt again.
Ah.
And the author argues this isn't protection at all. It's actually damaging. It leads straight to isolation, not safety.
Okay. So guarding is being wise in potential relationship, while walling off is basically preventing it altogether.
Exactly.
That distinction really sets the stage for these signs he talks about. He gives 5 specific indicators he feels might signal, hey, maybe it's time to take down those walls and be more open.
Precisely. They offer a kind of framework, from his perspective anyway, to assess your own readiness and maybe identify what's holding you back.
Let's look at the first one then. It's stated as, you are not scared of getting hurt. Okay, that sounds like a really tall order.
Yeah.
Does the author mean you literally have zero fear? Or is there more nuance to it?
Well, the source connects this pretty deeply to where your fear is actually rooted. The author suggests that fearing earthly things like getting hurt in a relationship is kind of tied to not having a proper or maybe complete fear of God. He references verses like Matthew 10.28 and Proverbs 1.7.
So the insight isn't about being immune to pain, but more about where your ultimate security rests.
Exactly. He even quotes 1 John 4.17-18, pointing out that God's perfect love drives out sinful fear. The nugget here seems to be, when your fundamental security, your bedrock, is in God's perfect love, then the potential for earthly hurt in a relationship just doesn't have the power to paralyze you or keep you walled off.
That's a powerful reframing. It makes sense. And it ties back to something mentioned later in the source, too. Like in Chapter 12, the author talks about healing from past hurts. I imagine that work is part of getting to a place where you're not scared, not because you won't feel pain, but because you've processed those old wounds and you're grounded in God's security instead.
Absolutely. Being able to be open after you've been hurt requires intentional healing. You can't just, hope it won't happen again. The past doesn't have to dictate your future openness, but you do have to address it.
Okay, that makes sense. Sign number 2 feels closely related. You are not scared of being rejected. How does the author approach this particular fear?
He's quite blunt about this one, actually. The source calls avoiding rejection a sure recipe for a life of isolation. He makes it really clear that pursuing love requires vulnerability.
Right.
And vulnerability inherently involves the risk of being turned down. There's no way around it.
So the very act of avoiding rejection is itself the thing that prevents connection.
Yes, that's the argument. The author emphasizes that eventually you kind of have to take the plunge, as he puts it. He references this again in Chapter 7, the idea of risking rejection. The nugget here is that the fear of rejection, if you let it rule you, is actually a guarantee of staying isolated. It's not a guarantee of safety. So facing that fear is presented as a necessary step towards potential connection.
That makes a lot of sense. Both those first 2 signs really seem to be about confronting fear that leads us to build those walls. Okay, moving on to sign number 3. You are not looking for supernatural signs. Now, this one might feel a bit surprising, right? Especially in a book about relationship signs. What's the author's point here?
Yeah, it can seem counterintuitive. But the author defines how he believes God primarily speaks through the Bible, through those internal impressions of the Holy Spirit, and through circumstances. But he makes a specific point, particularly in the introduction in Appendix Article 3, that for morally neutral decisions like, say, whether or not to go on a date with someone who seems like a solid, godly person. You shouldn't necessarily expect a specific Bible verse for that person or, a dramatic, unmistakable sign from heaven.
So waiting for that burning bush moment before you agree to a coffee date. That's
Yeah.
probably not the approach he's suggesting.
Correct. This sign suggests that maybe you've matured past needing that overwhelming, undeniable supernatural confirmation for every little step.
Okay.
The nugget here seems to be that being open involves trusting the guidance. You do have biblical wisdom, a sense of peace from the Spirit, maybe aligning circumstances and then stepping out in faith without demanding, a mystical sign for every single decision.
That flows really naturally into the next sign, number 4. God has shown you everything he is going to show you before you take a step of faith. This sounds like you have to act even when the whole picture isn't clear, like you don't get the full map.
It does, yeah, and that's essentially the author's point. He suggests that sometimes God reveals what he wants you to do, the action, the step of obedience, but deliberately doesn't reveal the outcome beforehand.
Which ties right back to the fear of getting hurt, I guess.
Exactly.
You might be called to step out even knowing the outcome could involve pain or disappointment.
Precisely. The source suggests obedience often means stepping out in faith, knowing there's a possibility of getting hurt, but trusting in God's trustworthiness. That's a theme in chapter 7 too, rather than trusting in a guaranteed positive result. So the nugget here is that faith often requires acting on, incomplete information, trusting the character of God more than the clarity of the path right in front of you.
Okay. And finally, sign number 5. There's nothing more to do besides be more proactive in interacting with the opposite sex. This one feels like where the rubber meets the road, doesn't it?
It really is.
Yeah.
It's the practical call to action that should follow all that internal work. The author basically argues there comes a point where you've done the praying, you've focused on your relationship with God, maybe processed past stuff, sought wisdom.
You've done the prep work.
Right. You can't stay in this perpetual state of preparation or just passive waiting forever. He uses that example, Joshua, in Joshua 7, where God essentially tells him to stand up. Instead of continuing to lie on his face praying, it's time to move.
So, if you've done the internal and spiritual work, this sign suggests the barrier isn't internal anymore, it's simply a lack of practical action.
Yes, that's the idea. The nugget is that preparedness eventually requires proactivity. It means intentionally creating opportunities to interact with the opposite sex. The author contrasts this with just a passive, sort of random approach in chapter 7 and suggests more effective ways might be natural interactions, like meeting people through shared activities or community, or maybe more intentional methods like online dating or being set up.
Right.
But the core point is, if you've done everything else, the next step is the interaction itself. You have to actually, interact.
Okay, those 5 signs give us a pretty clear framework for assessing readiness, at least from this author's perspective. But what if these signs resonate and someone listening realizes, yeah, I am walled off or I am held back by fear? How does the source suggest they actually become more open? Because like you said, it's not just flipping a switch.
You're absolutely right. It's definitely presented as a process. And the book touches on several principles throughout the excerpts that really support this growth in openness. You can think of these as ways to kind of cultivate the ground, make yourself ready. First, and this is foundational, it's prioritizing your relationship with God. The author really emphasizes this in chapter 2 and chapter 3. Making sure you are right with God, as he puts it, before deeply pursuing a human relationship is presented as crucial.
Why is that so primary?
Well, seeking God, first referencing Matthew 6.33, helps ensure you're not looking for a relationship to fulfill needs only God can truly meet. It prevents idolatry, basically, and grounds you in his peace, rather than, panic about being single.
So being open to a relationship actually starts with being fully connected and secure in God.
According to this source, yes. That relationship is the secure base that allows you to be open without desperation or misplaced priorities. Second, as we kind of touched on earlier, is healing. Chapter 12 is really explicit about this. Nothing will sabotage relationships more than the inner wounds of our own hearts. You can't be truly open if you're still operating from a place of deep, unaddressed pain or fear from the past.
Makes sense.
So overcoming that fear of hurt isn't just an intellectual exercise. It requires actively healing those wounds.
Healing sounds like a non-negotiable step then, for genuine openness. What else helps cultivate it?
Developing discernment is key. The author talks about this in chapter 11. Being open doesn't mean being gullible or just letting anyone into your life uncritically.
Right.
Discernment helps you see people accurately avoiding putting them on a pedestal or unfairly dismissing them based on superficial things, and it helps you navigate interactions wisely with healthy boundaries.
So openness requires wisdom, not just like unchecked vulnerability.
Exactly. Healthy boundaries, which are also linked to discernment in Chapter 11, are actually part of being open in a way that protects your heart wisely, rather than walling it off fearfully.
Okay. Wisdom and boundaries. What else?
Then there's the proactivity we saw in Sign 5. Cultivating openness means shifting from just a waiting posture to a more active one. It involves intentionally engaging. That might mean joining groups, asking friends for introductions, maybe trying those intentional methods like dating apps that the author discusses in Chapter 7. It's about putting yourself in situations where connection is actually possible, rather than just hoping it magically appears on your doorstep.
Taking some ownership of the process within wise limits.
Right. And seeking wise counsel is another piece of the puzzle, mentioned in Chapter 10 and Chapter 18. We all have blind spots, right? Especially when it comes to ourselves and potential relationships.
Yes, definitely.
So, trusted, godly friends or mentors can offer objective perspectives. They can help you see things you might miss when you're too close to the situation.
Yeah, the outside perspective can be invaluable.
And finally, I'd say managing expectations is crucial. The source, especially in places like Chapter 11, Chapter 15, and Appendix Article 1, advises against looking for some kind of perfect person or getting totally blinded by infatuation, which he covers in Chapter 15.
So don't get swept away.
Right. Openness isn't about falling for the very first person who shows interest. It's about wisely assessing potential partners based on biblical principles, looking for a fellow Christian, someone who's bearing fruit, someone ready for commitment. Those ideas come up in Appendix Article 1 and Chapter 8. And also, importantly, avoid rushing things that's mentioned in Chapter 17.
So it's really about wise, intentional, faith-filled engagement, not just a reckless free-for-all hoping for the best.
Precisely. Being more open, according to this source, seems less about trying harder to find someone, and maybe more about becoming the person God wants you to be. Someone who's rooted in his love, who's done the work of healing, who's discerning, and who was willing to step out in faith when the time feels right.
Yeah, the source really makes the case that being open to a relationship isn't just about your dating life in isolation. It seems deeply interwoven with your overall growth in faith, your personal healing journey, and ultimately, your trust in God's timing and his whole process for your life.
If we sort of zoom out and look at the bigger picture this source paints, it really seems the call to be more open is ultimately a call to be more vulnerable. But maybe not just with potential partners, but fundamentally with God himself.
That's a great point.
It feels like it's about trusting him with your deepest desires, your past hurts, your present fears, and your whole future, even when that path isn't laid out perfectly clear right in front of you. It's like vulnerability grounded in divine security.
Well said. That really captures it. Okay, well, that wraps up our deep dive for today into these signs Mark Ballinger suggests might indicate a call to more openness, and also the ways the source proposes you can maybe cultivate that readiness in your own life.
Yeah, hopefully exploring these ideas from the book gives you some helpful points to consider, maybe pray through on your own journey towards potential relationships.
And we've really only scratched the surface of this source. There's clearly so much more insight packed into these pages. Definitely stay tuned for future deep dives where we'll explore other fascinating topics.